Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. I am wearing my glasses because I'm about to read you an article or parts of an article from the New York Times. I wanted to mention a personal thought that I had just a few moments ago on Gaza. And I realize these two things may superficially appear unrelated. Sure. My cold and Gaza. How were they related? Not really related at all. But when I think about my cold, which causes me some degree of discomfort, not extreme, but some, I can sleep with NyQuil, but it's not the funnest thing in the world to have a cold, as I'm sure you know. It's not a horrible cold, but it's not great either. But then, in the midst of thinking about my cold, I think about Gaza and about how all the people are suffering and dying in that country while politicians squabble over what to do. I mean, why not just end it? Wouldn't that be the most logical and the simplest thing to do? Apparently not. And so this article I will read you is about Gaza. And superficially, it would appear to be good news. I mean, it's good news if it works out. And of course, nobody knows if it will work out. It may not. But then, with my cold, I remember that with all of the discomfort I may have, which is not that much, how much more discomfort are the people in Rafah feeling right now? Drinking from polluted water, drinking from water that was used in tampons, and drinking from seawater. That is genuine discomfort. Whatever I experience, however bad it may feel to me, it's all relative because my own life is a first world life. And a first world life cannot be compared in general. And I realize I'm making overgeneralizations, but in general, a first world life cannot be compared with a third world life. It just cannot. They are two entirely different sets of experiences. And so I suppose that does two things for me. One, it makes me more compassionate even than I was before about Gaza. And second, it makes me care less about my cold because who the F cares about my cold? Who the F cares about my cold? My cold is meaningless. It is here now. It will be gone in 1 or 2 days. Will the sufferings of the Palestinians in Gaza, in Rafah, be gone in a few days? I really, really doubt it. And even their lives before the Israeli invasion were horrible. So a return to the status quo is not much. It's basically a return to simply, I suppose, a lower level of misery, whatever the hell that means. So that's why I'm grateful for my cold, because it reminds me of how much more other people living in third world parts of the world are suffering, and that my suffering is really not even suffering in comparison to theirs. So that's my brief introduction. And now I will switch over to the article from the New York Times. It is written by Peter Baker, um, who was a well-known New York Times journalist, frequently appears as a commentator on television news as well. I have seen him many times. And this article attempts to, I guess, put a bright light on a very dark situation. And I hope that Peter's bright light is ultimately successful. I hope that it actually represents some type of shift in the horrendous situations of the Palestinians in Gaza and Rafah. It is titled, "In Threatening Israel, Biden Hopes to Avoid a Rupture." I wanted to comment on that title because it seems to me that the best solution is a rupture. Why not? Why not have a rupture between the United States and Israel? With the stuff that Israel is doing, aided by the United States, Israel could not do what it is doing without U.S. support. Why not have a rupture? And yet Biden is apparently threatening Israel in hopes of avoiding one. So be it. The subtitle of the article, "The President Has Put Israel's Leader on Probation," as a veteran diplomat put it. The threat is not idle, aides said, but he wants to force a course correction rather than follow through. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Because I personally am not at all optimistic that this course correction that is mentioned here will happen. And again, that goes back to the scheduled war crimes trials of Benjamin Netanyahu after he is no longer prime minister, which I assume, and many other commentators assume, will be after the war ends or after Netanyahu himself ends the war and is replaced by somebody else who will then continue it. And it is likely, many analysts think, that whoever replaces Bibi Netanyahu will be much further to the right than Netanyahu himself. That is the problem. So, the rupture, avoiding the rupture, as opposed to triggering it. That's what I would do. I would cause a rupture, an intentional rupture. Why not? Why not? Who would that hurt? Who would that help? It would hurt no one except Bibi Netanyahu, and it would certainly help the Gazans. So here is the article. By the time President Biden hung up the phone, he had finally delivered the threat he had refused to make for months. Israel had to change course, he told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or the United States would take action. Again, we will see. But the conversation ended on Thursday. As aides to Mr. Biden said, the president had reason to hope that the message had gotten through and that he would not have to carry out his threat after all. Again, Biden obviously has access to intelligence. I don't. But again, speaking as a civilian, as an amateur, as a non-politician, I don't see what incentive Benjamin Netanyahu would have to end the conflict or even to affect a course correction. I just don't see it, but I could certainly be wrong. Do I hope I'm wrong? Of course I do. Of course I do. I don't want to be right. I want to be wrong. I genuinely want to be wrong. During the call, Mr. Biden outlined several specific commitments he wanted Israel to make to avoid losing his support for the war against Hamas. Rather than pushing back, according to people informed about the call, Mr. Netanyahu promised that he would announce more humanitarian aid for Gaza within hours and signaled that he would respond to Mr. Biden's other demands in days to come. Mr. Netanyahu's government followed through later that night, authorizing the opening of a key port and another land crossing for food and other supplies. The White House expects Israel to soon issue new military procedures to avoid killing civilians and relief workers, and administration officials, meaning U.S. administration officials, will be watching carefully this weekend when Israeli negotiators joined William J. Burns, the CIA director, and Egyptian and Qatari intermediaries in Cairo to try again to broker a temporary ceasefire. A temporary ceasefire? That's what Biden is pushing for? A temporary ceasefire? Again, this whole thing makes no sense to me. It just doesn't. Why push for a temporary ceasefire, Joe Biden, when you can push for a permanent one? Continuing. Whether it will be enough to avoid the rupture that Mr. Biden never wanted in the first place remains unclear. Administration officials insisted that the president's threat was not an idle one, and that he was very strident, as one described him, in making his points to Mr. Netanyahu. At the same time, officials said Mr. Biden did not specifically threaten or to limit or cut off U.S. arms supplies during the call. Of course not. Of of course, he wouldn't do that. No, wouldn't do that. That would be too nice, as some Democrats have urged him to do. Nor did he set a deadline for Israeli action. The or else remained unclear and undefined. I mean, what commentary is necessary? He set no deadline. He set no deadline. Continuing. Biden has put Netanyahu on probation, said Aaron David Miller, a longtime Middle East peace negotiator, now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The president doesn't want to fight and has given him a test he can pass, certainly on humanitarian assistance and perhaps on negotiations with Hamas. U.S. red lines have a way of turning pink. Yes, they do. The only question is, does Netanyahu want to fight? At least some in Israel suspect that he does not. Just as Mr. Biden can now tell resistive members of his party that he is taking the stronger stance they have pushed him to take, Mr. Netanyahu may be able to use the heat from Washington to make changes that would otherwise be politically problematic for him. By signaling a potential shift in U.S. policy toward Israel, President Biden provided Prime Minister Netanyahu with the leverage to overcome the right-wing radicals in his government and secure its approval of a major increase in humanitarian aid for Gaza, said Michael B. Oren, a former deputy minister under Bibi Netanyahu and an Israeli ambassador to the United States. None of which means the two sides are certain to avoid a climactic crash. Their respective outlooks, goals, and political pressures regarding the war against Hamas are significantly different. Mr. Biden is ready for the war to be wrapped up as soon as possible, while Mr. Netanyahu has an interest in extending it. So, many moments that looked like turning points over the last 6 months have proved illusory. But the hope at the White House is that the president may have bought some room to maneuver. On Friday, officials welcomed the initial Israeli announcements on humanitarian aid as evidence that Mr. Biden has been able to deliver. We have seen some welcome announcements from the Israelis. John F. Kirby, a White House national security spokesman, said he told reporters that on a briefing call, they have acted on the president's requests coming out of that call. You're starting to see it for yourself. Even so, Mr. Kirby was careful not to declare victory. These were just announcements, he said. We've got to see results. We've got to see sustainable deliverables here over time. It's not enough just to announce it, but they have moved on some of the very specific requests that President Biden made. In his only comment since the call, President Biden did little to elaborate on his thinking. Asked by reporters before he boarded Marine One for a trip to Baltimore if he had threatened to cut off military aid, the president simply said, I asked them to do what they are doing. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. If that's all that he asked Netanyahu to do, it's not much. It's not much. It's not much. But I guess we'll see. As you know, I am a pessimist and a cynic. So bear that in mind. Whatever I say is always clouded with that veil of cynicism. Anything I say is. I acknowledge that. But he scoffed at the notion that he might be abandoning Israel. Oh, of course not. My comments, of course. Is that a serious question, he said? Some Republican critics accused him of just that. The president's ultimatums should be going to Hamas, not Israel. Speaker Mike Johnson wrote on social media. I don't understand what that means. What has Hamas done since their initial jailbreak? What have they done? Nothing. So what ultimatums can be given to Hamas? I don't understand what the guy is talking about. I assume he does, or maybe he wants you to think he does, but it makes absolutely no sense to me. Continuing, Hamas resisted a ceasefire, brought about needless bloodshed, and refuses to release Israeli and American hostages. Biden should not undercut our ally mindset amidst an existential threat by conditioning our support. On the other side of the aisle, at least some Democrats were not convinced that Mr. Biden had gone far enough. I guess that's good. If they mean it. Continuing, Senator Tim Kaine, a recent vice presidential candidate, if you remember, under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, of Virginia, praised the president for persuading the Israelis to facilitate more humanitarian relief. But this was an obvious solution that should have happened months ago. Yeah, months ago. I don't usually agree with Tim Kaine. I think he is mealy-mouthed. I don't think that he is really anything more than a Democrat of convenience. I mean, maybe all Democrats are Democrats of convenience. But my parents were Democrats, and they were not Democrats of convenience. They genuinely believed in what they saw as the traditional values of their party. Now, we used to argue all the time because I am a commie, not a Democrat, but I still admired the fact that they believed in traditional democratic ideals. Continuing, the current approach is not working. The Biden administration should prioritize the transfer of defensive weapons in all arms sales to Israel while withholding bombs and other offensive weapons that can kill and wound civilians and humanitarian aid workers. Mr. Biden's threat to Netanyahu was prompted by the killing of 7 relief workers for World Central Kitchen this week, which I've mentioned several times before on this podcast, which Mr. Kirby said left the president shaken. What about the killing of Gazans? How about that? Did that leave the president shaken? Did it? Did it? Well, obviously, I can't get an answer back from a newspaper article, but I wish I could. Continuing. Israel forwarded the results of its investigation to the U.S. on Friday and removed or reprimanded 5 military officers involved in the strike. But neither move satisfied critics who called for an independent inquiry. Mr. Kirby said American officials will review it carefully before passing judgment on the Israeli investigation. This incident and the call between Biden and Bibi Netanyahu may represent an important shift in the order of priorities. With civilian protection and humanitarian aid rising higher, said Brian Katulis, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, a Washington think tank who worked in national security positions under President Bill Clinton. Another heroic president. Sarcasm intended. But it remains to be seen what effect this will have. We will have to see how all this unfolds in the next few weeks. The extent of American influence on Israel's conduct of the war is complicated. Mr. Biden has repeatedly defended Israel's right to respond to the Hamas terrorist attack that killed an estimated 1,200 people on October 7th. Pause. Once again, it was not a terrorist attack. It was a jailbreak. Period. Period. End of sentence. It was a jailbreak. And that's all. Anybody who sees it as a terrorist attack is my enemy. And I am serious. My political enemy. I cannot countenance the views of anybody who says that Hamas engaged in a terrorist attack when clearly they were engaging in a jailbreak. He, Biden, has particularly warned Israel against sending troops into the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where more than 1 million refugees are sheltering from the war, without a credible plan to protect civilians. Mr. Netanyahu unabashedly defied Mr. Biden in public, declaring that he planned to move against Rafah to pursue Hamas leaders regardless of American pressure. Really, what that's saying is regardless of American money and military aid. That's the pressure. The U.S. could cut that off like that if it wanted to. But some 2 months have passed, and he has not done so yet, pending further consultations with Americans. Khalid Eldagani, a former advisor to Palestinian leaders in past peace talks with Israel, said Mr. Biden's shift was notable if belated. Well, the notable part, not sure about. The belated part, yes. Continuing. The tone of the president's statement is definitely more terse and stern than what we've heard before, he said. The linkage between U.S. policy and Israeli changes is very different from what we regularly hear from Biden administration officials about telling a sovereign state what to do? Well, it seems we are telling them what to do now, Mr. Eltagani said. That said, it's not clear exactly what the or else will be. Will they actually withhold military aid? I have my doubts. Me too. Might they allow a more forceful ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council? Possibly. Frank Lowenstein, a former special envoy for Middle East peace under President Barack Obama, said the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers provoked a visceral reaction in Mr. Biden. Well, look, if that's what it took, that's what it took. I mean, why the killing of Palestinians themselves did not provoke that visceral reaction is beyond me. But if the killing of World Central Kitchen workers under a celebrity chef did it, so be it. If it works, it works. But we don't yet know if it will work. Continuing. Biden was clearly angry enough to actually get Bibi Netanyahu's attention, he said, but the jury is still out on whether anything has actually changed for us, meaning the Americans, or for the Israelis. At this point, it is still mostly rhetoric. I would state it is still entirely rhetoric, but whatever. Bibi's political pendulum has temporarily swung from pandering to the extremists in his coalition to placating Biden. Note the word temporarily. Yeah, I agree with the word temporarily. Continuing. But the moves announced so far, Mr. Lowenstein added, are really baby steps that will not meaningfully change the horrific conditions for civilians in Gaza. And it would be typical of Bibi Netanyahu to announce the minimum steps necessary to avoid significant consequences, then slow roll implementation after the heat has died down. That is the article. I don't know what to say, except I guess I believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I see it. I have no optimism. As I said, I am pessimistic, but even my pessimism doesn't matter. Who cares? Who cares that I'm pessimistic? What matters is whether lives of the Palestinians in Gaza improve. That's all that matters. And that's what will bring at least some degree of satisfaction to me. Not entirely. I mean, ultimately, as I've said before, I would like to see a Palestine from the river to the sea run by anybody who lives there, whether Palestinians, Jews, or others. Any citizens, whatever a citizen is defined as, who lives there, and an end to the Zionist entity. To me, that is ultimately the only thing that will really bring meaningful changes to the conditions of the Gazans. But I sometimes think my problem is I'm not being pragmatic, which is true. By disposition, I am not a pragmatist. I'm a realist, a critical realist. In other words, to me, reality is not defined by immediate changes or improvements or by results. By results, that's pragmatism. You judge whether something is real by its results. I judge whether something is real by whether the lives of the oppressed have been emancipated. That's not pragmatism. That's the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar. And that is how I judge success, by emancipation and by transformation. Aside from that, I really don't know what else to say. If you have any thoughts or feelings, I would say feelings even more than thoughts. These days, I've been looking for feelings more than thoughts. I think they're much more important. Please share them in the comments section below the discussion section, podcast, discussion section, comment section. And I will read them and respond. For now, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.